Charlotte Powell stood beneath the warm lights of a packed charity gala, holding nothing more valuable than an old blue coffee mug with a chipped handle. In the front row, her brothers Ethan and Ryan Powell straightened their jackets, certain she was about to thank the family who had supported her through cancer. Instead, Charlotte quietly stepped off the stage and walked to the back of the room where a tired waitress had just arrived after finishing a late shift. Placing the mug into Emily Foster's trembling hands, Charlotte whispered, "The person who saved my life never shared my last name." The silence that followed was louder than any applause. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. Leave it in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. And if heartfelt stories about courage, kindness, and second chances mean something to you, consider subscribing so we can share many more journeys together. 8 years earlier, long before anyone applauded her courage or invited her to speak on brightly lit stages, Charlotte Powell lived a life so ordinary that most people would have walked past it without noticing. She was 34 years old and taught art at Maple Grove Elementary School on the west side of Columbus, Ohio. Every weekday began exactly the same. At 5:45 each morning, an old silver alarm clock buzzed on the wooden nightstand beside her bed. Charlotte never hit the snooze button. She believed mornings deserved respect. By 6:10, the smell of cinnamon oatmeal drifted through her tiny apartment. She watered the 2 African violets that had belonged to her late mother, Grace Powell, before packing her canvas tote bag with colored pencils, watercolor brushes, and stacks of construction paper. She drove a 12-year-old blue Honda Civic that rattled every time it crossed railroad tracks. She joked with her students that the car sang louder than she ever could. The children adored her. Not because she was the funniest teacher, not because she gave easy grades. They loved her because she remembered everything. She remembered who hated glitter, who loved dinosaurs, who had divorced parents, who quietly skipped lunch because money was tight at home. She never embarrassed anyone for needing help. Instead, she simply placed an extra apple or sandwich on a desk and smiled as if it had always belonged there. "You don't have to be the loudest color," she often told her students while mixing paint on wooden palettes. "Sometimes the quiet colors make the whole picture beautiful." It became her classroom motto. Few people knew where that kindness came from. Charlotte had lost her mother 6 years earlier after a long illness. Since then, holidays had become strangely quiet. Her father had died even earlier. Only her 2 older brothers remained. Ethan Powell lived in a large house outside Dublin, Ohio. At 46, he was a regional sales executive whose calendar seemed booked months in advance. Every conversation revolved around meetings, investments, or flights. Ryan Powell, 3 years younger, worked in luxury real estate. Charming, confident, and always impeccably dressed, he could convince almost anyone to buy a house. Yet somehow he never seemed to have time for family. Charlotte never complained. Every Thanksgiving she baked her mother's famous apple pie. Every Christmas she wrapped presents for both brothers' children. Every birthday she mailed handwritten cards instead of text messages. She always believed love was something you practiced, not something you counted. One rainy Saturday in April, she carried 2 warm pies to Ethan's house. The children hugged her. Her sister-in-law thanked her politely. Ethan accepted the pie while checking emails on his phone. "I'm sorry," he said without looking up. "I have a conference call in 5 minutes." Charlotte smiled. "That's okay, I wasn't staying long." She drove another 20 minutes to Ryan's neighborhood. He answered the door wearing a tailored navy suit. "I completely forgot you were coming," he admitted. "No problem. I've got clients waiting. I just wanted to drop off the pie." "You're the best, Charlie." He kissed her forehead before disappearing into his SUV. Charlotte stood alone on the driveway holding the empty pie carrier. For a moment she watched the taillights disappear around the corner. Then she whispered to herself, with a small smile, "They're just busy. It was the excuse she had been making for years. Monday arrived with another busy classroom. Near the end of the afternoon, Charlotte bent down to help a first grader tie his shoelaces. The room suddenly tilted. The bright posters on the wall blurred together. A sharp wave of dizziness rolled through her body. She grabbed the edge of a desk before collapsing completely. "Miss Powell!" Several children rushed toward her. "I'm okay," she lied softly. She wasn't. The school nurse insisted she visit an urgent care clinic before driving home. Charlotte almost declined. Medical appointments were expensive. She hadn't even used all her sick days. But the dizziness returned before she reached the parking lot. That evening, after several blood tests, the physician frowned. "I'd like you to schedule more imaging." "Is it serious?" "I don't know yet." 2 days later, she lay perfectly still inside an MRI machine, listening to its rhythmic pounding. She counted each loud, metallic thump, the way children counted sheep before sleeping. 28 minutes later, everything felt strangely normal again. Almost. 3 days passed before the hospital called. Could she come in Friday morning? No explanation, no details, just a request. Hospitals rarely invited people in to deliver good news. Still, Charlotte convinced herself it might be nothing. A harmless cyst, hormonal changes, stress. She even stopped by the grocery store afterward and bought paint for next week's butterfly art project. On Friday morning, James Cancer Hospital stood beneath a gray Ohio sky. Charlotte sat alone in the waiting room. Families surrounded her. An elderly couple held hands. A young father bounced a sleepy toddler on his knee. A teenage girl rested her head against her mother's shoulder. Charlotte noticed something unexpected. Everyone had someone. She was the only person sitting alone. She considered calling Ethan, then Ryan. Instead, she slipped her phone back into her purse. "They're working," she whispered. Dr. Benjamin Carter greeted her with calm eyes that had delivered difficult news thousands of times. He invited her into his office, closed the door, sat down without rushing. There was kindness in that silence, the kind that frightened people before words ever arrived. "I'm afraid the biopsy confirmed breast cancer." Charlotte heard every word, yet somehow they seemed to come from the far end of a long hallway. Stage 2. Aggressive, treatable, chemotherapy, surgery, months of treatment. Excellent chance if started immediately. She nodded politely while clutching the straps of her handbag. Her mind had stopped understanding after one sentence. "You have cancer." When the appointment ended, Dr. Carter handed her a thick blue folder filled with treatment schedules, insurance forms, nutrition guides, and appointment dates. It felt impossibly heavy. Not because of the paper, because of everything it represented. Outside, the spring air felt strangely cold. Charlotte sat on a wooden bench near the hospital entrance for nearly 40 minutes. Cars came and went. Ambulances arrived. Families embraced. She simply stared at the blue folder resting on her lap. Finally, she unlocked her phone. She called Ethan first. Voicemail. She left a calm message. "Hi, it's Charlotte. The doctor found something serious. Could you call me when you have a chance?" Then Ryan. He answered. "Hey, Charlie, can I call you back? I'm showing a property." "It'll only take a minute." "I'm with clients. I have cancer." Silence. A full 3 seconds. Then Ryan cleared his throat. "What are you sure?" "The doctor confirmed it today." "Oh," another pause. I'm really sorry." Charlotte waited. She thought he might say he was coming, that he would meet her at the hospital, that she shouldn't be alone. Instead, he said quietly, "Let's talk tonight, okay? I really can't leave right now." The line disconnected. Charlotte looked at the phone for a long time. Then she placed it gently back into her purse beside the thick blue folder. For the first time in years, she wondered whether busy was simply another word people used when they didn't know how to stay. The following Monday, Charlotte Powell walked into the principal's office carrying the same blue folder Dr. Benjamin Carter had handed her at the hospital. It was 7:42 a.m. The school hallways were still quiet except for the distant squeak of a janitor's cart and the laughter of a few children arriving early for breakfast. Principal Denise Walker looked up from her desk and immediately knew something was wrong. Charlotte had always smiled before speaking. This morning she couldn't. "I'll need some medical leave." Denise silently reached across the desk and took Charlotte's hand. "You don't have to explain." Charlotte shook her head. "I think I do." The words came slowly. "I have breast cancer." Denise's eyes filled with tears almost instantly. Without saying another word, she stood up and embraced her teacher. For several long seconds, Charlotte finally allowed herself to cry. Not because she had cancer, because someone had simply stayed. The school community surrounded her with handwritten cards, flowers, and drawings made by tiny hands. 1 second grader drew Charlotte wearing a superhero cape with crayons. Another wrote carefully, "Please get better because nobody mixes colors like you." Charlotte taped every single drawing to the refrigerator in her apartment. Some evenings she simply stood there reading them instead of eating dinner. The first chemotherapy session was scheduled for the following Thursday. At exactly 8:15 that morning, Charlotte checked into James Cancer Hospital carrying a canvas tote, a paperback novel she never opened, and a bottle of water. The treatment room was brighter than she expected. Large windows overlooked downtown Columbus. Comfortable recliners lined the room. Nurses moved quietly between patients, speaking in voices that somehow sounded both cheerful and gentle. Charlotte noticed something else. Most patients weren't alone. A husband held his wife's hand. A daughter adjusted a blanket around her father's shoulders. A teenage boy laughed softly while his grandmother dozed beside him. Every chair seemed to have another chair next to it, except hers. Nurse Melissa connected the IV. "This first session usually takes about 4 hours." Charlotte nodded. "You'll probably feel tired later today." "I teach children," Charlotte answered with a faint smile. "I'm already an expert at being tired." The nurse laughed. It was the first genuine laugh Charlotte had heard all week. The medication dripped slowly into her veins. Hour after hour. Outside, spring sunshine filled the parking lot. Inside, time seemed to move differently. Around noon, her phone vibrated. Ethan. Relief flooded through her. She answered immediately. "Hey. I've been thinking about you. I wish you were here." A pause. "I know. I start treatment today." "I remember." Another silence. "I'm sorry, Charlotte." She waited. "I've got meetings in Chicago tomorrow, and the kids have soccer this weekend, but I'll come as soon as things calm down." Charlotte looked across the room. An elderly husband was carefully peeling an orange for his wife. She swallowed hard. "Okay. You understand, right?" "Of course." He thanked her, as if she had done him a favor. The call ended. She placed the phone face down. 2 hours later, Ryan texted instead of calling. "How did it go?" Charlotte typed, "I'm still here." 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. Finally, his message arrived. "Hang in there." She stared at those 2 words. No question, no offer. No, "Do you need anything?" Just 2 words that sounded like something written inside a greeting card. By evening, the exhaustion hit like a collapsing wall. Her legs felt heavy. Even lifting her purse seemed difficult. Driving home wasn't safe. She sat in her car until the dizziness settled enough for her to grip the steering wheel. That became the pattern of her weeks. Every Thursday, chemotherapy, Friday, nausea, Saturday. Bone pain, Sunday. Trying to convince herself she was strong enough for another week. Medical bills began arriving almost immediately. One envelope, then another, then 5 more. Insurance covered much of the treatment, but not everything. Deductibles, medication, lab work, parking, special prescriptions. Each amount looked manageable by itself. Together, they became impossible. Charlotte quietly canceled her streaming subscriptions, stopped buying coffee, turned off the apartment's air conditioning unless absolutely necessary. She sold an antique sewing machine that had belonged to her grandmother. Then her bicycle. Then the small collection of watercolor brushes she had owned since college. Every item left the apartment carrying a memory with it. One afternoon, she opened her savings account online. The balance stared back at her. $2,814.63. 3 months earlier, it had been over $20,000. She closed the laptop without finishing the calculation. She didn't want to know exactly how long hope could be measured in dollars. Then came the day she sold the Honda Civic. The old blue car had traveled more than 180,000 miles. Its paint had faded. Its heater only worked when it felt like cooperating. But it had carried her everywhere. School, church, her mother's funeral, family holidays. Now a college student handed her an envelope containing $3,400 in cash. Charlotte smiled politely, signed the title, watched the Honda disappear around the corner, then walked the 22 blocks back to her apartment because spending $12 on a rideshare suddenly felt irresponsible. The following Thursday, she took bus route 8 to chemotherapy. She sat near the back, clutching her blue medical folder against her chest. A little girl boarded with her father and sat across the aisle. She looked at Charlotte's colorful scarf wrapped around her head. "I like your scarf," the little girl whispered. Charlotte smiled. "Thank you. My grandma wears scarves too." "They're beautiful, aren't they?" The child nodded enthusiastically. Charlotte never explained why she wore one. 3 weeks later, clumps of hair began appearing on her pillow, then in the shower drain, then on her sweater. She stood before the bathroom mirror for nearly 20 minutes, gently running her fingers through her hair. Each movement brought away another handful. She didn't cry. Not yet. She simply picked up the electric clippers she'd borrowed from a neighbor, sat on a kitchen chair, and slowly shaved the rest away. When it was finished, she looked at her reflection. For a moment, she didn't recognize herself. Then she remembered something she used to tell frightened children before their first art competition. The picture changes, but the person holding the brush doesn't. She repeated those words aloud. This time they sounded much harder to believe. That evening, after another long chemotherapy session, rain soaked the sidewalks outside the hospital. Charlotte had missed the last bus by 5 minutes. The next one wouldn't arrive for nearly an hour. Her stomach churned from the treatment. Her legs trembled with exhaustion. Across the street, a glowing neon sign reflected on the wet pavement. Maple Street Diner, open 24 hours. The smell of fresh soup drifted through the doorway as she stepped inside. Warm light replaced the cold rain. Only a handful of customers remained. A truck driver, 2 nurses finishing late shifts, an elderly man reading yesterday's newspaper. Charlotte quietly chose the booth beside the window. A young waitress with tired eyes, a neat ponytail, and a kind smile walked over carrying a pot of coffee. Her name tag read only one word: Emily. Neither woman knew it yet, but the next few minutes would quietly reshape both of their lives forever. Emily Foster had learned long ago that people rarely walked into Maple Street Diner after 9 o'clock because they were celebrating. The restaurant sat directly across from James Cancer Hospital, and over the years she had become surprisingly good at recognizing different kinds of silence. There was the silence of exhausted nurses ending a 12-hour shift, the silence of husbands waiting for surgery updates, the silence of parents pretending to smile for frightened children, And then there was the silence carried by patients leaving chemotherapy. It was quieter than all the others. Charlotte carried exactly that silence when she stepped through the diner's glass door. Emily greeted her with the same warm smile she offered every customer. "Good evening. Table for one." Charlotte nodded. "If that's okay." Of course. Emily led her to a booth beside the rain-speckled window. It wasn't the closest table to the kitchen, nor the easiest one for a server to reach during a busy shift. It was simply the quietest. "You can take your time." Charlotte slipped out of her damp coat and placed the thick blue hospital folder on the seat beside her. Emily noticed it immediately. She didn't stare. She didn't ask questions. She had seen enough blue folders to understand what they usually meant. Instead, she handed Charlotte a menu. "I'll be back in a minute." Charlotte opened the menu but barely looked at it. The prices caught her attention before the food did. Turkey sandwich, $12.95. Chicken noodle soup, $8.50. Grilled cheese, $7.25. She quietly reached into her purse. 2 $20 bills. 3 singles. Some coins. She mentally calculated tomorrow's prescriptions. Bus fare, electric bill. She closed the menu again. When Emily returned, she smiled gently. "What can I get for you?" Charlotte hesitated. "Just a cup of hot water, please." Emily tilted her head ever so slightly. "Only hot water. I'm not very hungry." It wasn't entirely a lie. Chemotherapy had stolen much of her appetite. But mostly she was trying to make $43 last until the following Tuesday. Emily nodded. "I'll be right back." A few minutes later she returned, carrying something unexpected. A steaming bowl of chicken noodle soup, a slice of buttered sourdough bread, and a blue ceramic coffee mug with a tiny chip near its handle. Charlotte looked confused. "I think there must be a mistake." Emily placed everything carefully on the table. "There isn't. I only ordered hot water." "I know." Charlotte reached for her wallet. "I can't afford all this." Emily leaned against the booth just enough to lower her voice. "The soup was made a little too early tonight." Charlotte glanced toward the kitchen. "It would have gone to waste. I'm sure someone else would have ordered it." Emily smiled. "Not this batch." Charlotte knew she was lying. The soup smelled fresh. Fresh parsley floated on top. Steam curled gently into the air. It hadn't been forgotten in the kitchen. It had been made for her. "I can't let you do this." "You're not." Emily pointed toward the mug. "The coffee's on me." "And the soup?" "The manager lets us feed someone every now and then." Another small lie. Charlotte didn't know that yet. Emily waited for another objection. None came. Instead, Charlotte whispered something almost too quietly to hear. "Thank you." Emily nodded once and walked away without making the moment feel larger than it needed to be. That was her gift. She never embarrassed people by making kindness look expensive. Charlotte wrapped both hands around the warm blue mug. The ceramic radiated heat into her fingers. She hadn't realized how cold she'd become. Outside rain continued tapping softly against the windows. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee mixed with cinnamon pie and grilled onions. For the first time since her diagnosis, the world felt almost ordinary again. Not happy, just normal. She took a careful sip. It was simple diner coffee. Nothing special, yet somehow it tasted like safety. Across the room, Emily quietly refilled another customer's drink before returning to the register. An older cook stepped out from the kitchen. "You gave away another meal." Emily smiled. "I covered it." The cook sighed. "You don't have much money yourself." "I know." "You keep doing this." Emily shrugged. "Some people need dinner more than I need another pair of shoes." The cook shook his head but smiled before disappearing back into the kitchen. Charlotte never heard that conversation. She slowly finished every spoonful of soup. The warmth settled into her aching body. By the time she reached the last bite, even the nausea from chemotherapy had eased. Emily returned carrying the check. Charlotte immediately reached for her purse. "I'll pay." Emily laid the receipt face down on the table. "No rush." Charlotte smiled politely. "I'd rather take care of it now." She flipped the receipt over. Printed neatly at the bottom was one line: "Balance due $0." Below it, written in blue ink, were 4 simple words: "Already taken care of." Charlotte looked up immediately. "No." Emily pretended to wipe the counter. "You really don't have to." "I can't accept charity." Emily walked back to the booth. "It isn't charity." "What is it then?" Emily looked at the blue mug still resting between Charlotte's hands. "My grandmother used to tell me something." Charlotte waited. "If you hand someone warmth, don't ask them to carry the bill, too." For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Charlotte quietly pushed $2 across the table. "At least let me leave a tip." Emily gently pushed the money back. "Keep it." "I insist." "So do I." Charlotte laughed softly for the first time in weeks. It surprised both of them. Emily smiled. "There it is." "What?" "That smile." "I forgot I still had one." "I don't think you did." Emily glanced towards the hospital, visible through the rain-covered window. "I think it's just been having a hard time finding its way back." Charlotte felt tears threaten again. She blinked them away. As she stood to leave, her legs wobbled slightly. Emily instinctively reached out, but stopped herself before touching her. Charlotte noticed. She appreciated it. Kindness without pity. Support without taking away dignity. She slipped her coat back on. "Thank you for everything." Emily picked up the empty blue mug, then paused. "You know," Charlotte turned. "My grandmother had another saying." "What was it?" Emily looked at the tiny chip on the mug's handle. Her thumb brushed gently across the cracked edge. "Broken doesn't mean empty." Charlotte stared at the old mug for a long moment. She wasn't sure why those 4 words settled so deeply inside her. Perhaps because, for the first time since hearing the word cancer, someone wasn't talking about survival. They were talking about worth. Charlotte smiled again. This time it reached her eyes. "I think I'll remember that." Neither woman realized those words, and that ordinary blue mug would become the beginning of a friendship that neither blood nor time would ever be able to match. Charlotte couldn't stop thinking about the blue coffee mug. It wasn't beautiful. Its glaze had faded after years of use, and the tiny chip near the handle was impossible to miss. Hundreds of customers had probably chosen newer mugs instead, leaving this one forgotten in the back of the diner's cabinet. Yet somehow it had found its way into her hands on the night she needed warmth more than anything else. The following Thursday, another chemotherapy session left her exhausted. The medication seemed stronger this time. By late afternoon, every joint in her body ached, as though winter had settled beneath her skin. Even buttoning her coat required more effort than she wanted to admit. When she stepped outside the hospital, her feet instinctively turned toward Maple Street Diner. She noticed it before she even reached the door. The neon sign glowed through the evening mist. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't walking somewhere because she had to. She was walking somewhere she hoped someone might remember her. The bell above the entrance chimed softly. Emily looked up from carrying 2 plates to a nearby table. Without hesitation, she smiled. "Window booth." Charlotte laughed quietly. "You remembered." "I remember everyone who likes sitting where the rain looks prettier." Charlotte settled into the same booth. This time she didn't need to study the menu. Emily returned, carrying a glass of water with lemon. "No menu tonight. I think I've already decided." Emily grinned. "The soup?" Charlotte nodded. If that's okay. I started making extra chicken noodle on Thursdays. Charlotte blinked. Why Thursdays? Emily answered while pouring coffee into the familiar blue mug. Because that's the day you usually look like the world has been especially unfair. Charlotte had lowered her eyes. No one had noticed something so small in a very long time. The soup arrived a few minutes later. Steam curled upward, carrying the comforting scent of rosemary and black pepper. Charlotte picked up her spoon, but stopped halfway. I'll pay for everything today. Emily leaned one elbow against the booth. We'll cross that bridge later. No. Charlotte smiled apologetically. I mean it. Emily studied her face. There was determination there. Not pride, not stubbornness, dignity. She respected that immediately. Then you'll pay for dinner. Charlotte relaxed. And the coffee? Emily shook her head. The coffee isn't for sale. Charlotte frowned. What does that mean? It means I've already decided. You can't keep doing this. I know. Why? Emily looked towards the front windows for a moment before answering. My grandmother raised me. Charlotte waited. Every morning she made coffee before sunrise. Emily smiled faintly at the memory. Our house was tiny. The roof leaked. The heater barely worked, but she always brewed enough coffee for one extra person. Did someone usually come? Sometimes. Who? Emily shrugged. A neighbor. A delivery driver. A widow from church. Someone whose car broke down. Sometimes nobody. Charlotte listened quietly. My grandmother said you never know when someone will need warmth more than caffeine. Emily gently tapped the rim of the blue mug. So she always left one cup waiting. Charlotte wrapped her fingers around the mug again. It reminds me of her. The conversation drifted naturally after that. Not about cancer, not about suffering. Instead, they talked about ordinary things. Favorite books, old movies, the first jobs they'd ever had. Charlotte admitted she had once wanted to become an illustrator for children's books before choosing teaching instead. Emily laughed. I wanted to be a veterinarian. What happened? I discovered I faint at the sight of blood. Charlotte smiled. So now you feed humans instead. I guess I do. Neither woman realized nearly an hour had passed. When Charlotte finally stood to leave, she noticed a framed watercolor painting hanging near the hallway, leading to the restrooms. It showed an old red barn surrounded by golden fields beneath an autumn sky. The brushwork wasn't professional, but it carried heart. Charlotte stopped in front of it. Who painted this? Emily looked over. Oh. She smiled. My daughter. Charlotte turned. You have a daughter? Emily nodded. Olivia. How old is she? 8. She's talented. Emily's expression softened. She'll be happy someone noticed. Charlotte wanted to ask more. Where was Olivia tonight? Who watched her while Emily worked double shifts? Did she like school? Did she paint often? Instead, she sensed there were stories Emily wasn't ready to tell. So she simply said, tell her she made someone smile. I will. Before leaving, Charlotte placed exact change beneath the receipt. This time Emily accepted it. As Charlotte reached the door, she paused. I almost didn't come tonight. Emily looked up from wiping another table. Why? I kept thinking I shouldn't get used to kindness. Emily considered the sentence carefully. Then she walked over. My grandmother had one more rule. Charlotte laughed. She had a lot of rules. The best people usually do. What was this one? Emily folded the dish towel over her arm. If someone offers you a chair when you're tired, she smiled. Sit down. Charlotte looked at her for several seconds. You make simple things sound important. Emily shook her head gently. I think simple things already are important. Outside, the rain had stopped. Charlotte walked toward the bus stop, feeling lighter than when she had arrived. Not physically. Her body still hurt. Her stomach still churned. Cancer hadn't disappeared. Neither had the bills waiting on her kitchen table. But something inside her had shifted. For weeks, she had measured her life by losses. Hair, strength, savings, plans. Tonight, without realizing it, she had spent nearly an hour talking about ordinary life instead of illness. That felt strangely miraculous. Back inside the diner, Emily picked up the empty blue mug. She washed it by hand instead of placing it in the dishwasher. The older cook noticed. You're babying that old thing again. Emily smiled. I like this mug. You've got 50 others. Not like this one, he chuckled. What's so special about it? Emily dried the chipped handle with a clean towel. It reminds people that something doesn't have to be perfect to be worth holding. The cook shook his head with an amused smile. You sound just like your grandmother. I hope so. That night, Charlotte returned to her apartment carrying more than leftovers wrapped carefully in foil. She carried the memory of conversation, of laughter, of being remembered. She pinned another hospital appointment onto the refrigerator beside her students' drawings. Then, almost without thinking, she took out her neglected watercolor set. Most of the brushes had already been sold. Only 3 remained. She dipped the smallest one into pale blue paint. Slowly, carefully, she began painting a simple ceramic coffee mug with a tiny chip along its handle. For the first time since her diagnosis, she wasn't painting because she needed a distraction. She was painting because something beautiful had happened. She just didn't know yet that this small watercolor would become the first piece in a journey that would eventually change far more lives than her own. By early October, Charlotte no longer measured time by calendars. She measured it by treatment cycles, 1 chemotherapy session, 3 difficult days, a few better mornings, then another infusion. Life had become a rhythm she never would have chosen, yet somehow learned to survive. Every Thursday evening after leaving James Cancer Hospital, she crossed the same intersection and walked toward Maple Street Diner. She never called ahead. She never made plans. Yet somehow Emily always seemed to know when she would arrive. The blue mug was waiting. Sometimes the soup was already warming. Sometimes there was fresh bread wrapped in a clean white towel. Nothing was announced. Nothing was dramatic. It was simply there, like sunrise. One cold Thursday, Charlotte entered looking paler than usual. Emily noticed immediately. You look different. Charlotte attempted a smile. I think the mirror said the same thing this morning. Emily didn't laugh. Instead, she crouched beside the booth. Are you hurting? Charlotte hesitated. She rarely admitted that. My bones feel like they're filled with broken glass. Emily quietly nodded. I'll bring you something warm. She returned carrying chicken and rice soup instead of noodles. My grandmother swore this helped. Charlotte accepted the bowl. I'm beginning to think your grandmother solved everything. Emily grinned. Only the important things. For nearly 20 minutes, they barely spoke. Charlotte slowly ate, while Emily served the dinner crowd. Every now and then, Emily glanced toward the window booth. Not to stare, just to make sure Charlotte hadn't fainted. Business was unusually busy that evening. A family celebrated a birthday. 2 police officers ordered burgers. Several hospital staff members stopped in after work. Emily moved quickly between tables, balancing trays with practiced ease. Around 8 o'clock, Charlotte quietly stood to leave. The room suddenly tilted. The floor slipped away beneath her feet. Her hand reached for the edge of the booth, but found only empty air. The next sound was the crash of a ceramic spoon hitting the floor. Emily turned instantly. Charlotte. She reached her just before she collapsed completely. The entire diner fell silent. I'm okay, Charlotte whispered automatically. Emily looked directly into her eyes. No, you aren't. Charlotte tried to stand. Her knees buckled again. Without hesitation, Emily pulled a chair beside the booth and knelt so they were eye level. I'm calling someone. No. Charlotte grabbed her wrist weakly. Please don't. You need help. I'll be fine. Emily recognized the fear hidden beneath those words. Not fear of illness. Fear of becoming someone else's burden. She gently covered Charlotte's trembling hand with both of hers. Do you have family? Charlotte closed her eyes. I have 2 brothers. Can I call them? A long silence followed. Finally, Charlotte nodded. They're in my phone. Emily carefully unlocked it using the passcode Charlotte whispered. The first contact read Ethan. She called. Straight to voicemail. She tried again. Voicemail? Emily left a calm message. This is Emily from Maple Street Diner. Charlotte isn't feeling well. Please call back as soon as possible. Then she called Ryan. He answered after several rings. Hello? My name is Emily. I'm with Charlotte. A pause. Charlotte? She became very weak after treatment. Is she in the hospital? Not yet. What happened? I think she needs someone with her. Ryan sighed softly. Emily almost missed it. I'm about 45 minutes away. Could you come? Another pause. I've got clients at a property showing. Emily waited. I really can't leave right now. She looked at Charlotte, whose eyes remained closed. She shouldn't be alone. I understand. But maybe call an ambulance if it's serious. Emily's grip tightened around the phone. So, you're not coming? I'll check on her tomorrow. The line disconnected. Emily stared at the silent screen for several seconds before placing the phone on the table. Charlotte opened her eyes slowly. They're busy. Emily swallowed. Charlotte, it's okay. No. Emily shook her head gently. It isn't. Charlotte looked toward the rain-covered window. I've spent months pretending it was. The words were spoken without anger, only exhaustion. Emily helped Charlotte sip a little water. Within minutes, the dizziness worsened. The cook walked over quietly. Call 911. Charlotte immediately objected. I can't afford another ambulance. Emily looked at her. You've thought about the bill before your health? Charlotte smiled weakly. That's what cancer teaches you. Emily made a decision. We're taking you ourselves. The cook immediately grabbed his truck keys. I'll drive. No, Emily answered. You've still got another hour on your shift. He looked toward the manager. I'll finish closing, the manager said firmly. Go. 10 minutes later, Charlotte sat in the passenger seat of the cook's old pickup truck, while Emily held a blanket around her shoulders. No one spoke much during the drive. The windshield wipers pushed away steady rain. Streetlights reflected across wet pavement. Charlotte watched familiar buildings slide past. I ruined your shift. Emily looked at her as though the sentence made no sense. You fainted. I'm still sorry. You apologize too much. Charlotte managed the smallest smile. My mother used to say good manners cost nothing. Emily answered softly. Tonight they almost cost you asking for help. Charlotte looked away. James Cancer Hospital's emergency entrance glowed ahead. Doctors quickly examined Charlotte. Severe dehydration, low blood pressure, chemotherapy complications. She would need to stay overnight for observation. After the nurses settled her into a room, Charlotte noticed the time. 11:43 p.m. Emily stood near the doorway. You should go home. Emily shook her head. It's late. I know. You've worked all day. I know. You'll be exhausted tomorrow. Emily smiled. Probably. Charlotte sighed. You don't have to stay. Emily pulled a chair beside the hospital bed. Then she removed a paperback novel from her purse. The Secret Garden. Charlotte looked surprised. That's my favorite book. I remember. When did I tell you that? You didn't. Emily smiled. You always look at the copy on the shelf near the register. Charlotte blinked. You noticed that. I notice lots of things. Charlotte laughed softly despite the IV attached to her arm. Emily opened the book. Would you like me to read? Charlotte suddenly felt tears gathering again. No one had read to her since her mother died. She nodded. Emily began quietly. There was once a little girl called Mary. The hospital room grew still. Outside rain continued falling across Columbus. Machines beeped softly. Nurses passed through the hallway. Inside room 417, one woman, who shared Charlotte's blood, slept peacefully somewhere across the city without knowing she had been admitted. Another brother prepared for another day of meetings. Neither came, but a waitress earning barely enough to pay her own bills sat beside Charlotte until nearly 2 a.m, reading chapter after chapter whenever she stirred awake. Just before Charlotte finally drifted into deep sleep, she whispered something so quietly, Emily almost didn't hear it. My mother used to read that to me. Emily gently marked the page with a receipt from the diner. Then we'll finish it tomorrow. She stayed until Charlotte's breathing became slow and peaceful. Only then did she quietly turn off the bedside lamp. For the first time since hearing the word cancer, Charlotte was no longer spending the night completely alone. Charlotte was discharged from the hospital the following afternoon with 2 new prescriptions, strict instructions to rest, and another stack of paperwork tucked inside the now familiar blue folder. Before she left, Dr. Benjamin Carter stopped by her room. You gave us a scare. Charlotte smiled apologetically. I'm getting good at that. He pulled a chair beside the bed. You need to stop trying to fight this alone. Charlotte looked toward the window. I'm trying. No, he spoke gently. You're surviving alone? There's a difference. She didn't answer. Dr. Carter glanced toward the hallway where Emily had just returned from buying crackers and bottled water at the hospital gift shop. Your sister? Charlotte smiled. No. Friend? She thought for a moment. I think she's becoming family. The doctor nodded with quiet approval. Sometimes family arrives later than we're expecting. Emily walked in carrying the small paper bag. I brought plain crackers. The nurse said they might help. Charlotte laughed softly. I feel like everyone's giving me homework. Emily placed the bag beside the bed. Mine comes with snacks. 2 days later, Charlotte returned to her apartment. The silence inside felt heavier than usual after spending a night where another person had simply been present. She unpacked her medications, placed hospital papers into a drawer, watered her mother's African violets, then sat in the old kitchen chair staring at the unfinished watercolor painting of the chipped blue mug. For the first time in weeks, she picked up a brush, not because she felt inspired, because painting reminded her that she still knew how to make something instead of merely enduring something. The strokes came slowly, soft blue shadows, a warm cream-colored background, the tiny crack along the handle. She added one sentence beneath the mug. Broken doesn't mean empty. She wasn't planning to show anyone. She simply needed to see those words where she could not forget them. A few days later, Emily knocked on her apartment door. Charlotte blinked in surprise. You found my address. Emily held up a folded hospital discharge paper. You accidentally left this in the diner. Charlotte laughed. So I did. I promise I wasn't spying. I never thought you were. Emily stepped inside, carrying a reusable grocery bag. You also forgot to buy groceries. Charlotte looked confused. What? Emily smiled. I guessed. Inside the bag were soup ingredients, bananas, oatmeal tea, whole grain bread, and several containers labeled with handwritten cooking instructions. You made all this. Most of it. You shouldn't have. I know. Charlotte looked at the food, then at Emily. When do you sleep? Emily laughed. Sometimes. Together they unpacked groceries into the tiny kitchen. Charlotte noticed Emily moving carefully around the apartment. She never opened cabinets without asking, never commented on the worn furniture, never treated the small space with pity. Instead, she admired the paintings leaning against the walls. You made these, Charlotte nodded. I used to paint more. They're beautiful. I don't know about that. Emily stopped in front of a watercolor of children flying kites beneath a summer sky. They feel hopeful. Charlotte smiled. I've always liked hopeful things. Emily turned toward another unfinished canvas. Several colorful handprints covered the page. What was this for? My students. Charlotte's face softened immediately. Every spring we made a mural together. You miss them. Every day. Without teaching, Charlotte suddenly realized how empty her weeks had become. Hospital, apartment, diner, hospital again. Cancer had quietly stolen the ordinary routines that once gave her life shape. Emily seemed to sense the same thing. What if you painted anyway? Charlotte shrugged. For who? For yourself. Charlotte looked unconvinced. Emily continued. Or, she hesitated, for children who can't leave the hospital. Charlotte slowly looked up. What do you mean? Emily pulled a folded flyer from her purse. I saw this on the pediatric floor. It advertised a small volunteer art afternoon for children receiving long-term treatment. The coordinator needed extra supplies and volunteers whenever possible. Charlotte read every word. I don't know if I'm strong enough. You don't have to stay all day. I don't even know if they'll want me. Emily smiled. They're children. They'll want someone who brings paint. The following Tuesday, Charlotte gathered what few art supplies she still owned. Most expensive brushes had been sold months earlier. The remaining ones were mismatched and worn. She added crayons donated by former students and several packs of construction paper Denise Walker, her principal, had quietly mailed after hearing about Charlotte's illness. Emily drove her to the hospital. You didn't have to take time off. I traded shifts. You keep doing that. Emily shrugged. I'll survive. Charlotte looked through the passenger window. You always say that. Emily smiled without answering. The pediatric oncology playroom buzzed with quiet excitement. Children wearing masks sat around colorful tables. Some pushed IV poles decorated with superhero stickers. Others wore knitted hats instead of hair. Charlotte froze in the doorway. She suddenly saw reflections of herself everywhere. Not in age, not in appearance, in courage. One little boy waved enthusiastically. Are you the art lady? Charlotte blinked. I hope so. The room erupted with laughter. Within minutes, she was helping children mix colors. One little girl insisted purple should taste like grapes. Another painted dinosaurs wearing winter scarves. A 7-year-old boy carefully painted a crooked blue coffee mug. Charlotte knelt beside him. Tell me about your picture. My grandma's mug. What's special about it? It's broken. Charlotte smiled. Does she still use it? Every morning. Why? The boy looked surprised by the question. 'Cause it still holds coffee. Charlotte felt something tighten gently inside her chest. By the end of the afternoon, she was physically exhausted, but emotionally, something had awakened. As Emily drove her home, Charlotte stared quietly out the window. "I forgot something." Emily glanced over. "What?" "I forgot I still had something to give." Emily smiled without taking her eyes off the road. "I never forgot." The volunteer coordinator called 2 days later. "The kids loved you." Charlotte laughed. "I think they mostly liked the paint. I think they liked the person holding the paint." Soon, Charlotte began visiting every other week between treatments. Some afternoons she could stay only an hour. Other days she lasted nearly 3. The children never complained if she became tired. They simply slid another chair beside theirs and continued coloring together. She began creating small watercolor postcards for patients who were too sick to leave their rooms. Each painting carried tiny flowers, birds' rainbows, or steaming coffee mugs. On the back, she wrote the same sentence every single time. "Broken doesn't mean empty." Charlotte never signed her full name, only one word: friend. Slowly, almost invisibly, cancer stopped being the only thing that defined her days. She was still a patient, but she had become something else again. A teacher, not inside a classroom, but exactly where frightened hearts needed one most. Winter arrived quietly. The trees outside Charlotte's apartment surrendered their last leaves, and cold winds swept through Columbus with a sharpness that made even short walks feel exhausting. By December, her chemotherapy treatments were finally ending. The final infusion was strangely emotional. The nurses who had cared for her for months gathered around her chair with a small paper certificate and a plastic bell hanging near the treatment room entrance. Patients who completed chemotherapy were invited to ring it. Charlotte stared at the bell for several seconds. Nurse Melissa smiled. "Whenever you're ready." Charlotte stood slowly. Her legs still felt weak, but they held. She wrapped her fingers around the rope and rang the bell once. The clear sound echoed through the room. Several patients applauded softly. Others simply smiled with knowing eyes. Charlotte cried. Not because everything was over, because she knew recovery was only beginning. Outside the hospital, Emily waited with 2 paper cups of hot chocolate. "I figured today deserved something sweeter than hospital coffee." Charlotte laughed through her tears. "I think you're right." They sat together on a bench overlooking the parking lot. For several minutes, neither woman spoke. Finally, Emily asked, "What are you thinking?" Charlotte looked at the steam rising from her cup. "I'm trying to remember who I was before cancer." Emily considered the question. "I don't think she's gone." "I hope not. I think she's just carrying a few more scars." Charlotte smiled faintly. That evening she returned home and found 2 unopened voice messages, one from Ethan, one from Ryan. Both had been left several days earlier. Neither knew that day had been her final treatment. She listened anyway. Ethan's message lasted 23 seconds. "Hey, Charlotte. Sorry I missed your call last week. Things have been crazy. Hope you're feeling better. We'll get together after the holidays." Ryan's was even shorter. "Merry Christmas, Charlie. Let's catch up soon." Charlotte deleted neither message. She simply listened to them once, then placed her phone face down on the table. Something inside her had changed. Not into anger, into clarity. For months she had waited for the moment her brothers would finally arrive. Now she understood something painful. Some people never come. Not because they can't, because they choose not to. That realization hurt, but strangely, it also set her free. Christmas Eve arrived with light snow falling over the city. Charlotte carried a homemade apple pie to Maple Street Diner. Emily laughed as soon as she saw the box. "You brought dessert. You've fed me for months." So tonight you don't get to argue." Emily accepted it with a grin. "I'll consider this a peace offering." After her shift ended, Emily invited Charlotte to meet someone. A little girl hurried out from the back office carrying a sketchbook almost as large as herself. "Mom," Emily knelt. "Olivia, this is Charlotte." The 8-year-old smiled shyly. "I know." Charlotte looked surprised. "You do? Mom talks about you." Emily blushed. "Not that much." Olivia giggled. "Every Thursday." Charlotte laughed. "I hope only the good parts." "Mostly." Olivia opened her sketchbook. "I wanted to show you something." Inside were watercolor paintings, birds, flowers, snow-covered trees. One page stopped Charlotte immediately. It showed a chipped blue coffee mug sitting beside a steaming bowl of soup. "You painted this?" Olivia nodded proudly. "Mom told me about your favorite mug." Charlotte looked at Emily. "You've been telling stories." Emily shrugged. "Only true ones." Charlotte gently touched the drawing. "It reminds me of hope." Olivia smiled. "I like drawing hopeful things." Charlotte froze for a second. Those were almost the exact words she had spoken only months earlier. She realized kindness had already begun traveling farther than either of them knew. When spring finally returned, Charlotte's strength slowly followed. Her hair began growing back in soft curls. She could walk farther without stopping. Food tasted normal again. Dr. Benjamin Carter smiled during one follow-up appointment. "Your scans look very encouraging." Charlotte exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. So, keep living." She laughed. "I've been trying." "I can tell." She continued volunteering at the pediatric oncology unit every week. Soon, one afternoon became 2. Children began asking specifically for Miss Charlotte's Art Day. Parents stayed to paint beside their children. Nurses joined during lunch breaks. The tiny activity room slowly transformed into one of the happiest places on the floor. One afternoon, the hospital administrator stopped by. "I've never seen this room so full." Charlotte looked around. Children covered in paint laughed together despite IV poles standing beside nearly every chair. "We're just making pictures." The administrator smiled. "I think you're making something much bigger." Months later, the hospital asked whether Charlotte would help organize a permanent therapeutic art program. The position was part-time. The pay was modest. Charlotte accepted immediately. The classroom she had lost was slowly being replaced by another. Only this one existed inside a hospital. Every child who entered reminded her why she had survived. Meanwhile, contact with Ethan and Ryan grew increasingly rare. Birthday texts, holiday greetings, occasional promises to visit. Most never happened. Charlotte stopped rearranging her schedule in anticipation. She stopped inventing excuses for them. She stopped measuring love by hope alone. Instead, she measured it by presence. Emily was present. Olivia was present. The nurses were present. The children waiting excitedly for Thursday art class were present. She finally understood that family was less about shared blood than shared burdens. One Saturday afternoon, Charlotte opened an old storage box that had belonged to her mother. Inside, she found dozens of handwritten letters. One envelope had her name on it. She unfolded the fading paper carefully. Grace Powell's handwriting flowed neatly across the page. "If life ever teaches you who cannot carry your pain, don't spend forever asking why. Look instead for the people who quietly picked it up without being asked. Those are the ones heaven sends." Charlotte A. read the sentence 3 times. Then she quietly folded the letter again. She drove directly to Maple Street Diner. Emily looked up from refilling coffee. "Everything okay?" Charlotte walked over without speaking. Then she wrapped Emily in a long embrace. Emily hugged her back. "What happened?" Charlotte smiled through tears. "My mother answered a question I've been asking for a year." "What question?" Charlotte looked around the familiar diner. The chipped blue mug sat drying beside the coffee machine. I kept wondering why my brothers weren't there. Emily waited. Charlotte gently shook her head. Today I realized something better. What's that? I've spent too much time grieving the people who walked away. She looked directly at Emily, and not nearly enough thanking the ones who walked in. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Neither woman noticed the old blue mug catching the afternoon sunlight, its chipped handle still visible, its purpose completely unchanged. Like both of them, it had never stopped holding warmth. 8 years passed more quickly than Charlotte ever imagined they would. The tiny watercolor postcards she had once painted at her kitchen table slowly grew into something far larger than anyone expected. What began as one volunteer art afternoon each week became a hospital-supported healing program. Then another hospital asked for guidance. Then another. Parents began writing letters describing how painting had helped children speak about fears they could never put into words. Doctors noticed anxious young patients became calmer during treatments after attending Charlotte's classes. Social workers started requesting her artwork for grieving families. The messages arrived one after another. A mother from Cleveland, a grandfather from Cincinnati, a nurse from Pittsburgh. Each letter carried a different story, yet all of them seemed to say the same thing: hope could be taught. At 42 years old, Charlotte Powell stood in a bright studio filled with easels, paintbrushes, and shelves lined with children's artwork. A simple wooden sign near the entrance read, "Broken doesn't mean empty foundation." Beneath the name stood a small, painted image of a chipped blue coffee mug. Visitors often assumed it was a logo created by a designer. Very few knew it had once been an ordinary mug, sitting inside a neighborhood diner. Charlotte refused to replace it with something more polished. Imperfection was the entire point. One Tuesday morning, she walked through the studio greeting volunteers, preparing supplies for another hospital outreach event. "Morning, Miss Charlotte." "Good morning." "Did the canvases arrive?" "They're in the storage room." A little girl wearing hearing aids ran over carrying a painting covered with colorful butterflies. "I finished." Charlotte knelt beside her. "You certainly did. Do butterflies remember being caterpillars?" Charlotte smiled. "I hope so." "Why?" "So they never forget how brave they were." The little girl hugged her without another word before running back to the art tables. Charlotte watched her go with quiet gratitude. Years earlier, she had wondered whether her own life still had purpose. Now, purpose seemed to greet her every morning. Inside her office hung dozens of framed watercolor paintings created by children over the years. One wall remained different from all the others. There, inside a simple wooden frame, rested her very first painting of the chipped blue mug. Below it appeared the handwritten sentence she had painted during chemotherapy. "Broken doesn't mean empty." She still looked at it every day before beginning work. Not because she needed reminding, because she never wanted to forget. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Emily stepped inside, carrying 2 paper coffee cups. Some habits had survived every passing year. "I figured you hadn't eaten breakfast," Charlotte laughed. "You've been saying that for 8 years." "And I've usually been right." Emily looked older now, though only slightly. Fine laugh lines rested near her eyes. The kindness in them hadn't changed at all. She had left full-time waitressing several years earlier. Now she served as community outreach director for the foundation organizing volunteers, fundraising dinners, and hospital partnerships. Charlotte often joked that Emily had simply exchanged one way of feeding people for another. Emily placed 1 coffee cup on the desk. "I've got today's schedule." Charlotte accepted it. "Busy." Emily laughed. "Always." She read aloud. "Morning hospital visit. Lunch meeting with donors. Afternoon family workshop. And tonight," Emily paused dramatically, Charlotte smiled. What? The Community Hope Gala. Charlotte groaned playfully. I still don't enjoy speeches. I know. You always make me do them. I absolutely do. Charlotte shook her head. You enjoy this too much. Emily grinned. I really do. On the opposite wall stood another display cabinet. Inside rested the original chipped blue mug. Not because it was valuable, because it was sacred. The handle remained chipped. The glaze remained faded. It had never been repaired. A small plaque beneath it simply read, "The cup that started everything." Later that afternoon, Charlotte visited the pediatric oncology floor where she had first volunteered years earlier. Several nurses recognized her immediately. Miss Charlotte. Nurse Melissa. The two embraced warmly. I can't believe how much this program has grown. Charlotte smiled. Neither can I. Melissa pointed toward a hallway filled with children's artwork. You know, every floor in this building uses your art carts now. Charlotte looked around. Bright paintings covered walls that had once seemed painfully gray. The smell of crayons replaced some of the cold sterility she remembered from her own treatments. I wish my younger self could see this. Melissa squeezed her hand. I think she'd be proud. As Charlotte prepared to leave, she noticed a familiar man speaking with hospital administrators near the elevators, Dr. Benjamin Carter. His hair had turned almost completely silver. He looked up and immediately smiled. Charlotte Powell. She laughed. You still remember my full name? I remember every patient who teaches me something. They shook hands warmly. I hear your foundation has expanded into 4 cities. We're trying. He looked around the colorful hallway. I've spent decades treating cancer. Then he looked directly at her. You taught me healing isn't always the same thing. Charlotte felt unexpectedly emotional. I learned that from someone else. That evening, volunteers gathered at the foundation office before leaving for the annual gala. Large boxes filled with auction items lined the hallway. Children's paintings decorated nearly every table. One volunteer held up a framed watercolor. Should this go in the silent auction? Charlotte walked over. The painting showed a little boy holding his grandmother's hand beside a blue coffee mug. She smiled. No. It's already sold. The volunteer looked confused. To who? Charlotte answered softly. To me. She purchased at least one child's artwork every year, not because she needed more paintings, because every child deserved to know their story mattered. As the sun began setting over Columbus, Charlotte stood quietly in her office, changing into a navy evening dress for the gala. She fastened a small silver pin, shaped like a paintbrush, onto her jacket. Then she carefully opened the display cabinet. She lifted the old blue mug with both hands. Its weight felt exactly as she remembered. Warm memories flooded back. Rain outside the diner, chicken soup, Emily reading in the hospital, the sentence that had carried her through the darkest months of her life. She traced the chipped handle gently with her thumb. A soft knock came at the door. Emily stepped in. Ready? Charlotte looked at the mug one last time. I think so. Emily smiled. You've carried that thing through every gala. Charlotte laughed. It keeps reminding me where everything began. Emily nodded. And where we're going. Neither woman noticed that several miles away, 2 brothers named Ethan and Ryan Powell were preparing to attend the same charity gala after reading newspaper articles praising the nationally recognized founder of the Broken Doesn't Mean Empty Foundation. They had no idea that the woman receiving tonight's Lifetime Community Impact Award was the younger sister they had once promised to visit tomorrow. The ballroom shimmered beneath warm crystal chandeliers. Round tables filled with community leaders, physicians, volunteers, former patients, and donors stretched across the elegant hall. Children's watercolor paintings decorated every centerpiece, instead of expensive floral arrangements. Charlotte had insisted on that. She believed Hope deserved the best table in the room. Guests continued arriving while volunteers welcomed families near the entrance. Emily moved effortlessly through the crowd, making sure every child found the activity corner prepared with crayons, sketchbooks, and watercolor sets. Charlotte watched from backstage. Even after 8 years, large gatherings still made her nervous. Emily stepped behind the curtain, carrying the familiar blue mug. "You forgot something," Charlotte laughed. "I don't know how." "I do." Emily handed it to her. "You've got too many things on your mind." Charlotte accepted the mug with both hands. "I always speak better when this is nearby." Emily smiled. "I know." Before either woman could say anything else, Charlotte's phone vibrated. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number. She almost ignored it. Instead, she answered. "Hello?" A woman's calm voice responded. "Is this Charlotte Powell?" "Yes." "My name is Sarah Jennings. I'm calling from Riverside Children's Medical Center." Charlotte immediately became attentive. "Is everything okay?" "We've heard wonderful things about your foundation." Charlotte smiled. "Thank you." Sarah hesitated. "I actually have a different reason for calling." Charlotte waited quietly. "We have a 9-year-old patient named Lily Bennett." The name meant nothing to Charlotte. "She has been receiving treatment for leukemia." Charlotte's smile slowly faded. "Her mother passed away 2 years ago." Her heart tightened. "Her father works 2 jobs and rarely leaves the hospital," Sarah continued gently. "Lily stopped speaking several weeks ago." Charlotte listened carefully. "One of our nurses showed her photographs from your foundation's website." And, for the first time in nearly a month, Sarah paused. She asked whether the lady with the paintbrush could come visit. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. Whenever possible. She looked through the ballroom doors where hundreds of guests had gathered to celebrate the foundation. Then she looked at the blue mug in her hands. "I'll come tomorrow morning." After ending the call, Emily immediately noticed the change in Charlotte's expression. "What happened?" Charlotte quietly explained. Emily didn't hesitate. "We'll leave at sunrise." The gala proceeded beautifully that evening. Charlotte accepted the Community Impact Award with gratitude. She thanked volunteers, nurses, teachers, donors, parents. She spoke about courage, children, and creativity. But privately, her thoughts remained with a little girl named Lily waiting in another hospital. The following morning, Charlotte and Emily drove nearly 2 hours to Riverside Children's Medical Center. The autumn sun had barely risen. Neither woman spoke much during the drive. Charlotte packed a watercolor set, blank paper brushes, and a small wrapped gift. Inside the gift sat a ceramic mug, not the original. A handmade copy painted by one of the children from the foundation. Its handle intentionally included a tiny chip. When they arrived, Sarah Jennings greeted them warmly. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Charlotte shook her hand. "You said she asked." Sarah nodded. "She rarely asks for anything." They walked quietly through the pediatric oncology ward. Hallways echoed with soft conversations and the distant beeping of monitors. Sarah stopped outside room 214. "Lily's father is inside." Charlotte knocked gently. A tired man in his early 40s opened the door. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. His clothes were clean but wrinkled. He looked as though sleep had become a distant memory. "I'm David Bennett." Charlotte introduced herself. "I've heard so much about your work." He looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry you had to drive all this way." Charlotte smiled kindly. "I wanted to come." Inside the room, 9-year-old Lily Bennett sat quietly by the window. She held a stuffed rabbit, missing one button eye. She didn't look toward the visitors. Instead, she continued watching falling leaves outside. David whispered softly. She hasn't painted since treatment started. Charlotte slowly walked over. She didn't introduce herself immediately. She simply sat beside Lily. Together they watched leaves drifting through the wind. After nearly a full minute, Charlotte spoke. "That red one almost looks like it's dancing." Lily didn't answer. Charlotte wasn't discouraged. She opened the watercolor box without another word. One brush, one cup of water, one blank sheet. She began painting. Not anything complicated, just a simple blue coffee mug. Lily slowly shifted her eyes towards the paper. Charlotte pretended not to notice. Several more quiet minutes passed. Finally, a tiny voice asked, "Why is it broken?" Charlotte looked up. "Because someone loved it for a long time." Lily stared at the painted mug. "It still works." Charlotte nodded. "Perfectly." Lily considered that answer. "My rabbit's missing an eye. I noticed. People said I should get a new one." Charlotte smiled. "What do you think?" Lily hugged the rabbit closer. "I like this one." "So do I." For the first time, Lily looked directly into Charlotte's face. "My mom fixed his ear." Charlotte nodded gently. "Then every stitch reminds you of her." Lily whispered, "Yeah." Charlotte reached into her bag and carefully unwrapped the small ceramic mug. "I brought you something." Lily accepted it with both hands. Her fingers slowly traced the tiny chipped handle. "It matches your painting." "It does." "Why?" Charlotte smiled softly. "Because broken doesn't mean empty." Lily repeated the sentence almost silently. "Broken doesn't mean empty." David stood quietly near the doorway, his eyes filled with tears. Sarah looked away respectfully. Lily placed the mug beside her stuffed rabbit. Then, after weeks of refusing nearly every activity, she quietly reached for one of Charlotte's paintbrushes. "What should I paint?" Charlotte smiled. "Anything you miss." Lily thought carefully. "My mom's pancakes." Charlotte laughed softly. "I'd love to see those." Within 20 minutes, colorful paint covered the table. Lily painted pancakes, her rabbit, autumn leaves, a bright yellow sun, and finally 3 people sitting together drinking hot chocolate from blue mugs. Charlotte never asked who they were. She didn't need to. As Emily watched quietly from the doorway, she realized something extraordinary. 8 years earlier, a frightened woman had walked into a diner believing she had nothing left to give. Now children in hospitals hundreds of miles away were waiting for the chance simply to spend one afternoon with her. The kindness that had begun with one bowl of soup had traveled farther than either of them had ever imagined, and neither woman realized that news coverage of last night's gala and photographs from today's hospital visit were already making their way across social media, where 2 brothers named Ethan and Ryan Powell were about to recognize a face they hadn't truly seen in nearly a decade. The drive home from Riverside Children's Medical Center felt unusually quiet. Emily kept both hands on the steering wheel while autumn sunlight stretched across the highway. Charlotte held Lily's newest painting carefully on her lap. 3 blue mugs, 1 little rabbit, 1 bright yellow sun. At the bottom, written in uneven handwriting, were 5 simple words. Broken doesn't mean empty. Charlotte smiled to herself. She's going to be okay. Emily glanced over briefly. "I hope so." "No." Charlotte shook her head gently. "I don't mean her illness. I mean her heart." Emily nodded. "I think you're right." For a few miles, neither woman spoke. Then Charlotte noticed something unusual. Emily rubbed the left side of her forehead. Once, then again a few minutes later. "You okay?" Emily forced a smile. "Just tired." "You've said that 3 times this week." "I've been busy." Charlotte looked at her more carefully. Dark circles rested beneath Emily's eyes. The cheerful energy she usually carried seemed dulled. When they reached Columbus, Emily insisted on dropping Charlotte off first. "I'll see you tomorrow." Charlotte hesitated. "Promise you'll get some rest." "I promise." Emily smiled, waved, and drove away. Charlotte watched until the car disappeared around the corner. Something didn't feel right. The next morning, Emily didn't answer her phone. That wasn't unusual during meetings, but she didn't answer again at noon, or later that afternoon. Charlotte decided to stop by the foundation office. Emily wasn't there. One of the volunteers looked up. "Oh, Charlotte. Have you seen Emily today?" The volunteer's expression changed. "She left early." "Is everything okay?" "We're not really sure." "She looked pale during the morning meeting." Charlotte immediately picked up her phone again. Still no answer. Without another word, she drove toward Emily's small house across town. Olivia, now 16 years old, opened the front door before Charlotte had a chance to knock twice. Relief immediately crossed the teenager's face. "Miss Charlotte?" "Olivia. Mom didn't want to call you." Charlotte's heart sank. "Where is she?" "On the couch." Emily tried to sit up when Charlotte entered the living room. "I'm fine." Charlotte folded her arms. "I've heard those exact words before." Emily laughed weakly. "They didn't work on you then either." A thermometer rested on the coffee table beside unopened medicine. Charlotte picked it up. "How long have you had a fever?" "Since yesterday." "And you were still at work this morning." Emily looked guilty. "We had donor meetings." Charlotte sighed. "You've been taking care of everyone except yourself." Emily didn't argue, because she knew it was true. Olivia quietly spoke from the kitchen doorway. "She's been coughing all week." Charlotte turned. "Did she see a doctor?" Emily answered before Olivia could. "Not yet." Charlotte reached for her car keys. "You're going now." Emily opened her mouth to object. Charlotte raised one eyebrow. "I learned from the best." Emily blinked. "What?" Charlotte smiled. "Remember a rainy night 8 years ago?" "When I fainted in the diner," Emily nodded slowly. "You didn't ask whether I wanted help?" "You needed help." Charlotte smiled warmly. "So do you." An hour later, they sat together inside an urgent care clinic. After several tests, the physician returned. "Good news." Emily looked relieved. "You have pneumonia." She laughed nervously. "I've never been so happy to hear bad news." The doctor smiled. "We caught it early. But you absolutely need to rest." He looked directly at Emily. "No working. No meetings. No volunteering. No pretending you're invincible." Charlotte tried not to smile. The lecture sounded strangely familiar. Back at Emily's house, Charlotte quietly took charge. She filled prescriptions, cooked soup, organized medications, made Olivia promise to text her every evening with Emily's temperature. Emily watched from the couch in amused disbelief. "I don't remember giving you permission to become my boss." Charlotte carried over another blanket. "You didn't. I've created a monster. You created a survivor." Emily became quiet. Late that evening, after Olivia had gone upstairs to finish homework, Emily looked toward Charlotte. "I need to tell you something." Charlotte sat beside her. "What is it?" Emily stared at the cooling bowl of soup. "There were days," she hesitated. "During your treatment." Charlotte waited patiently. "When I couldn't afford groceries for both of us." Charlotte looked surprised. Emily continued softly. "I'd make enough soup for the diner. Then I'd tell you there was extra." Charlotte felt tears gathering. "There wasn't extra," Emily smiled gently. "Sometimes. But not always." Charlotte couldn't speak. I'd bring leftovers home for Olivia. And I'd eat toast. The room fell completely silent. Charlotte slowly shook her head. You never told me. You already had enough to carry. Charlotte looked down at her own hands. All those Thursdays, all those bowls of soup, all those quiet conversations. She had believed Emily was sharing abundance. Instead, she had been sharing sacrifice. Charlotte whispered, Why? Emily answered without hesitation. Because no one should fight cancer hungry. Charlotte reached over and took Emily's hand. You were struggling too. Emily smiled. We all struggle. I just happened to be standing. Charlotte laughed softly through tears. You make generosity sound ordinary. Emily shrugged. Maybe it should be. The next several days became a reversal of everything they had experienced years before. Charlotte arrived each morning carrying groceries. She made breakfast, reminded Emily to take antibiotics, straightened blankets, answered foundation emails, handled donor calls. Even the volunteers noticed the change. Whenever someone asked where Emily was, Charlotte simply smiled. She's finally following doctor's orders. Olivia watched everything quietly. One afternoon, she found Charlotte washing dishes. I've wanted to ask you something. Charlotte turned. Anything. Mom always says you saved each other. Charlotte smiled. I think that's true. But Olivia hesitated. Who saved who first? Charlotte looked toward the living room where Emily had finally fallen asleep after several restless nights. She answered without thinking. It doesn't matter. Olivia looked confused. Charlotte dried the last plate before continuing. When people keep score, kindness becomes a transaction. She placed the plate into the cabinet. Your mother never counted what she gave me. So, I'll never count what I give back. Olivia smiled. I think that's why you're family? Charlotte looked at the teenager she had watched grow from a shy little girl with a sketchbook into a compassionate young woman. Then she quietly answered, I think we became family long before either of us realized it. From the living room came Emily's sleepy voice. Are you two talking about me? Charlotte laughed. Only good things. Emily smiled without opening her eyes. Good. Then, for the first time in many years, she allowed herself to rest completely, knowing that the woman she had once refused to leave alone in a hospital bed was now keeping watch over her instead. The circle of kindness that had begun with one bowl of soup had quietly come home. Emily returned to the foundation 3 weeks later. The volunteers applauded the moment she walked through the front door. Someone had taped a handwritten sign above the reception desk. Welcome back, Emily. Olivia laughed as her mother covered her face. Oh no. Charlotte folded her arms with an innocent expression. I have absolutely no idea who organized this. Emily looked around the room. Every volunteer suddenly became fascinated by clipboards, coffee cups, or absolutely anything except making eye contact. Emily smiled. You're all terrible liars. The laughter that followed filled the building. For the first time since becoming ill, Emily realized how deeply this place had become her second home. She slowly walked through the studio, stopping at nearly every table. Children waved. Parents thanked her. Several volunteers hugged her before she even reached her office. Charlotte watched quietly from across the room. Years earlier, Emily had once believed she was just a waitress. Now dozens of lives quietly reflected otherwise. That afternoon, Charlotte called everyone together. I've got one more surprise. Emily immediately looked suspicious. I don't like that smile. You will. Charlotte handed her a small envelope. Inside rested a new employee identification badge. Emily frowned. What is this? Turn it over. She did, The title beneath her photograph no longer read Community Outreach Director. Instead, it read Executive Director. Emily stared silently at the card. She looked at Charlotte. I can't. Charlotte smiled. You already have. For years. I don't have your experience. Charlotte shook her head. I can teach budgets. I can teach fundraising. I can teach management. She stepped closer. But I can't teach people to care the way you naturally do. Emily's eyes filled with tears. This foundation exists because you carried one frightened woman through the hardest year of her life. She gently touched the new badge. I've been waiting 8 years to officially make you my partner. The room erupted into applause. Emily laughed through tears. You really planned all this? For months. Emily embraced Charlotte tightly. I don't deserve this. Charlotte whispered, That's exactly why you do. The weeks that followed brought exciting changes. Emily's ideas transformed the foundation in unexpected ways. She created a volunteer meal program for exhausted parents sleeping beside hospitalized children. No family would have to wonder where their next meal was coming from. She organized neighborhood restaurants willing to donate soup sandwiches and fresh fruit. When restaurant owners asked why the program mattered so much to her, Emily always answered the same way. Because healing is harder when you're hungry. She never mentioned the diner. She never mentioned Charlotte. She simply smiled. Soon, dozens of businesses joined, then hundreds of volunteers. The meal program expanded almost as quickly as the art program had years earlier. One afternoon, Charlotte found Emily standing quietly inside the storage room. What are you doing? Emily held up an old soup ladle. I borrowed this from Maple Street Diner. Charlotte smiled immediately. Mr. Alvarez finally let you take it. He said it belonged here now. The owner of Maple Street Diner had officially retired earlier that year. Before selling the restaurant, he visited the foundation carrying one cardboard box. Inside rested simple objects from the old diner. The soup ladle, several handwritten recipe cards, one faded Thursday special sign, and photographs of employees gathered around the kitchen over many Christmases. Charlotte carefully unpacked each item herself. They created a small display called Where Kindness Began. Visitors often spent longer there than anywhere else in the building. Not because the objects were valuable, because they proved extraordinary things sometimes begin in very ordinary places. One Friday afternoon, Olivia stopped by after school carrying college brochures. Emily looked up from her desk. So, Olivia smiled nervously. I got accepted. Charlotte happened to be walking past the office. She turned immediately. Accepted where? Olivia laughed. Ohio State. Emily gasped. You did? Olivia nodded excitedly. For art therapy. Charlotte covered her mouth. No. Really? Olivia handed over the acceptance letter. Charlotte read every word before looking back up. I'm so proud of you. Olivia smiled. I know what I want to do now. Emily looked curiously at her daughter. What? I want to help children like you two helped them. Charlotte laughed softly. I think you're going to be wonderful. Emily quietly wiped away tears. Your grandmother would have loved this. Olivia nodded. I think so too. A few days later, the foundation hosted its monthly family workshop. Parents painted alongside children recovering from cancer, heart surgery, and other serious illnesses. The room buzzed with conversation. Near one table, Lily Bennett carefully mixed shades of blue into a ceramic mug she was painting. Her father David smiled nearby. Charlotte walked over. That color looks familiar. Lily grinned. It has to. It matches the mug. Charlotte laughed. I should have guessed. Lily looked healthier now. Color had returned to her face. Her treatment continued, but hope had clearly returned much sooner. David quietly approached Charlotte while Lily painted. "I've wanted to thank you." "You already have?" "No." He shook his head. "You gave my daughter back pieces of herself." Charlotte smiled gently. "She did most of that." David looked across the room toward Emily, helping another little boy wash paintbrushes. "I've been meaning to ask." "Ask what?" "How did the two of you meet?" Charlotte glanced toward Emily. Their eyes met from opposite sides of the room. Emily smiled without knowing the conversation. Charlotte smiled back. Then she answered, "Over a bowl of soup." David laughed. "I was expecting a much bigger story." Charlotte quietly replied, "That is the bigger story." Later that evening, after the last family left, Charlotte and Emily remained behind, cleaning tables together. The foundation had grown too large for them to handle every task themselves, yet they still insisted on helping stack chairs after every workshop. Emily balanced paint jars inside a cabinet. "You know." "What?" "We could hire people to do this." Charlotte smiled. "I know." "Then why don't we?" Charlotte looked around the now empty studio, because every chair she folded reminded her of hospital playrooms. Every paint stain reminded her of frightened children learning to smile again. Every quiet evening reminded her of how far they had come. She answered simply, "I never want success to make us forget service." Emily nodded. "I was hoping you'd say that." As they turned off the lights and prepared to leave, neither woman noticed a black SUV parked quietly across the street. Inside sat two middle-aged men studying the illuminated foundation sign. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Ethan Powell broke the silence. "That's really Charlotte." Ryan stared through the windshield. "I didn't know." His voice trailed away. Neither brother had expected the newspaper articles to lead them here. Neither had expected to see hundreds of families walking out smiling. And neither was prepared for the realization slowly settling between them. The little sister they had been too busy to visit had somehow spent 8 years becoming the kind of person the entire city now admired. While they had been building careers, she had been rebuilding lives. The black SUV remained parked across the street, long after the lights inside the foundation had gone dark. Neither Ethan nor Ryan moved. The illuminated sign reading, "Broken doesn't mean empty foundation," reflected faintly across the windshield. Ryan finally broke the silence. "I don't know what to say." Ethan stared at the building. "I don't either." For several moments, the only sound came from passing traffic. Ryan leaned back in his seat. "I honestly thought she moved away years ago." Ethan looked down. "I stopped asking." The words hung heavily between them. Neither man could remember exactly when calling Charlotte tomorrow had quietly become maybe next month. Months had become years. Years had become almost a decade. Eventually, Ethan started the engine. "We should leave." Ryan looked toward the front entrance one last time. "Yeah." But neither brother slept much that night. The next morning, Ethan sat alone at his kitchen table with a cup of untouched coffee. His wife, Melissa, noticed immediately. "You've been quiet since yesterday." He nodded. "I saw Charlotte." Melissa smiled. "You finally met up?" He looked ashamed. "No. I saw her from across the street." Melissa frowned. "What do you mean?" He slowly explained everything. The newspaper article, the foundation, the hundreds of families leaving the building, the award, the volunteers. When he finished, Melissa remained silent for several seconds. Then she asked one gentle question. "When was the last time you actually visited your sister?" Ethan searched his memory. Birthdays blurred together. Christmases, text messages, voicemails, promises. He couldn't remember. His silence answered for him. Melissa reached across the table and squeezed his hand. I think you already know why this hurts. Across town, Ryan experienced a similar morning. His daughter Emma, now in college, walked into the kitchen while he stared blankly at his phone. What are you looking at? He turned the screen toward her. An interview with Charlotte had appeared online. She was laughing beside children painting colorful murals inside a hospital. Emma smiled. She seems nice. Ryan nodded quietly. She's my little sister. Emma blinked. You've never introduced us. The sentence landed harder than Ryan expected. No, I haven't. Emma studied the photograph again. What does she do? Ryan swallowed. She helps sick children. Emma smiled warmly. Mom would have liked her. Ryan looked away. She would have. Emma sat across from him. So why haven't we ever met? Ryan couldn't answer. Because there wasn't a good answer. Only excuses. Later that afternoon, both brothers independently searched the Foundation's website. They found photographs spanning years, children covered in paint, parents smiling through tears, hospital hallways transformed by artwork, volunteers delivering meals. There was even a page called Our Story. Neither man expected to see themselves mentioned. They weren't. Instead, the story described how one waitress had quietly supported a woman during cancer treatment. No names beyond Emily and Charlotte. No bitterness, no blame, no mention of brothers who had failed to appear. Ryan whispered to himself, she never even talked about us. Ethan noticed the same thing. Charlotte had not built the Foundation on resentment. She had built it on gratitude. That somehow made their absence feel even heavier. 3 days later, the Foundation hosted another family workshop. Charlotte spent most of the morning helping children decorate small ceramic mugs. Each child painted something meaningful: rainbows, dinosaurs, family pets, favorite foods. Lily Bennett painted tiny sunflowers around her blue mug. Charlotte smiled. They're beautiful. My mom loved sunflowers. Charlotte nodded. I can tell. Across the room, Emily laughed while teaching parents how to blend watercolor skies. Everything felt ordinary, peaceful. Until the front reception volunteer quietly approached. Charlotte? She looked up. Yes? There are 2 gentlemen asking if they can speak with you. Charlotte wiped blue paint from her hands. Did they leave their names? The volunteer hesitated. They said. She glanced toward the entrance. Ethan and Ryan Powell. Time seemed to pause. Charlotte remained completely still. The room around her continued buzzing with conversation. Children laughed. Brushes dipped into water. Someone accidentally spilled yellow paint. Life continued. Yet inside Charlotte, old memories slowly stirred. Emily noticed the change immediately. She walked over quietly. What happened? Charlotte answered calmly. My brothers are here. Emily looked towards the lobby. You don't have to see them. Charlotte thought for a moment. Then she smiled gently. I think I do. She wasn't angry. Not anymore. She simply felt calm. She washed her hands, straightened her sweater, and walked toward the reception area. Ethan stood first. Ryan followed. Both suddenly looked uncertain. For several seconds, no one spoke. Charlotte studied their faces. They looked older, grayer, more tired. Time had changed all 3 of them. Ethan finally smiled awkwardly. Hi, Charlie. She returned a polite smile. It's been a long time. Ryan nodded. Too long? Silence settled again. Finally, Ethan spoke. We saw the Foundation. Charlotte nodded. I'm glad. It's incredible. Thank you. Ryan looked around the building. We had no idea. Charlotte answered honestly. I know. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck nervously. We've been talking. She waited patiently. We weren't there. His voice cracked slightly. When you needed us. Charlotte didn't interrupt. Ryan looked down. I kept telling myself I'd visit after work. Then after the holidays. Then after things slowed down. They never did, Charlotte quietly replied. No, they usually don't. Neither accusation nor bitterness entered her voice. That somehow made the conversation even more difficult. Ethan's eyes filled with regret. I don't expect forgiveness. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. I forgave you years ago. Both brothers looked surprised. Ryan whispered, You did? Charlotte nodded. I couldn't carry anger forever. Ethan looked relieved for only a second before another emotion replaced it. If you forgave us. He struggled to finish the sentence. Why didn't you call? Charlotte answered softly. I did. The words hit both men immediately. Voicemails, missed calls, canceled visits, promises to come next week. She had called, many times. Ryan closed his eyes. I'm sorry. Charlotte nodded gently. I know. She believed him, not because apology erased the past, because his voice carried genuine sorrow. Ethan looked toward a wall filled with children's paintings. We missed so much. Charlotte followed his gaze. Yes. We missed your recovery. Yes. We missed all of this. Another quiet nod. Yes. For several moments, no one spoke. Finally, Charlotte smiled gently. But today isn't 8 years ago. Ryan looked at her. No. It isn't. Charlotte folded her hands calmly. I can't change who stood beside my hospital bed. Her eyes drifted briefly towards the art room where Emily was laughing with several children. And I won't pretend those years didn't happen. Both brothers nodded silently. But, she looked back at them, if you're here because you feel guilty. Neither answered. No. Guilt isn't something I can heal for you. Ethan slowly lowered his head. If you're here because you want a relationship, she paused. That begins today. Those words surprised even Emily, who had quietly stepped into the hallway without interrupting. Charlotte wasn't reopening the past. She was simply refusing to let it control the future. Ryan swallowed hard. Do you think? He hesitated. There's still room for us. Charlotte looked around the busy foundation filled with children, volunteers, and families. Then she answered with quiet honesty. There's always room. But relationships aren't rebuilt with apologies. She smiled gently. They're rebuilt with presence. Neither brother could find words, because for the first time in many years their little sister wasn't asking them to promise anything. She was simply giving them the opportunity to finally show up. Winter returned to Columbus with soft snow drifting across the city. Inside the Grand Civic Center, hundreds of guests gathered for the Foundation's annual Hope Gala. Unlike previous years, this evening celebrated more than fundraising. It marked 10 years since the first hospital art program had opened its doors. Large screens displayed photographs from throughout the decade, children painting in treatment rooms, parents sharing quiet smiles over bowls of donated soup, volunteers unloading art supplies, doctors kneeling beside easels instead of hospital beds. Every image carried the same quiet message. Healing rarely happened alone. Backstage, Charlotte adjusted the sleeve of her navy dress while looking over a short stack of note cards. Emily peeked around the curtain. You're rewriting your speech again. Charlotte smiled. I always do. You'll ignore those cards anyway. I probably will. Emily laughed. You definitely will. On a nearby table sat the old chipped blue mug. It had become part of every important event. Not because Charlotte believed it brought luck, because it reminded her to stay grateful. A volunteer hurried backstage. "They're ready for you." Charlotte took a slow breath. Before walking toward the stage, she quietly touched the mug's worn handle. "Thank you." Emily heard the whisper. She knew Charlotte wasn't speaking to the mug. She was speaking to every moment it represented. The ballroom lights dimmed. The audience applauded as Charlotte stepped onto the stage. She paused for a moment, looking across hundreds of familiar and unfamiliar faces. Doctors, teachers, former patients, children now grown into teenagers, parents who once believed they would never smile again. She smiled warmly. "Good evening." The applause settled. When people ask how this foundation began, they usually expect a complicated story. A few guests smiled. The truth is much simpler. It began with kindness. She looked toward the display case near the stage, where the blue mug rested beneath a spotlight. It began with someone who believed a frightened stranger deserved a warm meal. Emily lowered her eyes. Charlotte continued. "None of us know which ordinary moment will become someone else's turning point. You may never know. But kindness has a remarkable habit. It keeps traveling long after we stop watching." The audience listened quietly. Charlotte spoke about children whose artwork now decorated hospital corridors across 4 states. She thanked volunteers who had delivered tens of thousands of meals. She honored nurses who comforted frightened families every day. Then she looked toward the front row. Emily sat beside Olivia. Lily Bennett sat nearby with her father proudly holding a sketchbook. Dr. Benjamin Carter smiled warmly from another table. Charlotte's voice softened. "I also want to thank one person who never asked for recognition." Emily immediately shook her head. Charlotte smiled. "I'm afraid it's too late." The audience laughed gently. "Years ago, I believed surviving cancer meant defeating disease." She paused. "I was wrong. Survival also means finding people who refuse to let you disappear." Charlotte looked directly at Emily. "The woman who saved my life never shared my last name." Silence filled the ballroom. I spent months waiting for certain people to arrive. They never did. But someone else kept showing up. Again. And again. And again. Emily quietly wiped away tears. Charlotte continued. "She brought soup when I had no appetite. She read books while I slept through chemotherapy. She reminded me that broken doesn't mean empty long before I believed it." The audience rose into spontaneous applause. Emily covered her face, embarrassed. Charlotte laughed. "I know, you don't like attention. But sometimes gratitude deserves witnesses." When the applause finally faded, Charlotte noticed movement near the back of the ballroom. Ethan and Ryan had quietly entered after the ceremony began. Neither wanted to interrupt. Neither expected anyone to notice. Charlotte saw them immediately. For only a brief second, their eyes met. Then she continued speaking without hesitation. "Life has taught me another lesson. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing." The room grew completely still. Forgiveness frees the heart. Trust grows one faithful day at a time. She didn't look toward her brothers again. She didn't need to. The words reached them anyway. When the speech ended, every person in the ballroom stood. The applause seemed endless. Charlotte stepped away from the podium. Emily met her just off stage. "You weren't supposed to make me cry." Charlotte laughed through tears. "You started it 10 years ago." Guests soon filled the reception hall. Children ran between tables. Volunteers reunited with families they had helped years before. Near one display, Ethan quietly approached Charlotte. "May we talk?" She nodded. The 3 siblings stepped into a quieter hallway overlooking the snowy courtyard. No cameras followed, no audience remained. Only silence. Ryan spoke first. "We heard what you said." Charlotte nodded. "I hoped you would." Ethan looked toward the snow outside. "I've spent the last few weeks wondering if I deserve another chance." Charlotte answered honestly. "I don't think relationships are earned by deserving." He looked at her. "I think they're earned by showing up." Ryan swallowed hard. "We want to." Charlotte smiled gently. "Then start." Neither brother heard anger in her voice, only truth. Ethan reached into his coat pocket. "I brought something." He handed Charlotte a small envelope. Inside was an old photograph. 3 children sat beside their mother. Grace Powell, drinking hot chocolate. Charlotte laughed softly through sudden tears. "I haven't seen this in years. I found it while cleaning Dad's old boxes." On the back, written in Grace's familiar handwriting, appeared a short sentence. "Take care of each other when I'm gone." All 3 siblings stared at the words. Ryan whispered, "We failed her." Charlotte slowly shook her head. "No." Both brothers looked surprised. "We failed each other." Another silence followed. This one felt different. Less heavy. More honest. Charlotte carefully returned the photograph to its envelope. "I can't promise everything becomes what it used to be." Ethan nodded. "I wouldn't ask that." "But," she smiled softly, "if you really intend to keep showing up." She looked from one brother to the other. "The next family workshop is Saturday." Ryan blinked. "You're inviting us." "I'm inviting you to help wash paintbrushes." Ethan laughed unexpectedly. "That's it," Charlotte smiled. "It's where everyone starts." The 3 of them walked back toward the ballroom together. Not side by side. Not yet. But no longer walking in opposite directions. Inside, Emily watched them return. She quietly smiled. Not because every wound had healed, but because healing had finally begun where excuses had ended. And waiting beside the stage beneath its small spotlight, the chipped blue mug remained exactly as it had always been. Broken. Never empty. Saturday morning arrived with bright winter sunlight pouring through the tall windows of the foundation. Inside the art studio, tables slowly filled with paintbrushes, colored paper, and rows of unfinished ceramic mugs. Volunteers greeted families by name. Children raced toward their favorite seats. The familiar warmth of laughter settled naturally into every corner of the room. Charlotte carried the old blue mug into the studio and placed it beside the sign that read, "The cup that started everything." She smiled as Lily Bennett hurried over. "I brought something." Lily proudly held up a sketchbook. "I finished it." Charlotte opened the pages carefully. Inside were drawings from the past year. Hospital rooms transformed into gardens. Doctors wearing superhero capes. Parents sleeping peacefully beside children. And on the final page, one simple picture. A cracked blue mug overflowing with bright yellow sunflowers. Across the top, Lily had written, "Broken things can still grow beautiful things." Charlotte blinked away tears. "I think this belongs in our gallery." Lily beamed. "Really?" "Absolutely." While volunteers prepared the workshop, the front door quietly opened. Ethan stepped inside, carrying a box of pastries. A few seconds later, Ryan followed with 2 large containers of coffee. Neither wore a suit. Neither seemed entirely comfortable. They simply looked like 2 men trying very hard not to turn around and leave. Emily noticed them first. She walked over with her usual calm smile. "Good morning." Both brothers nodded awkwardly. "We're probably early." "You are?" Emily glanced at the boxes in their hands. "But you came prepared?" Ryan laughed nervously. "We weren't sure what people usually bring." Emily smiled. "Usually just themselves." She pointed toward the kitchen. "The pastries can go over there." Within minutes, Charlotte joined them. She offered each brother a simple hug. No dramatic speeches, no emotional confrontation. Just a quiet welcome. "Ready to work?" Ethan nodded. "What do you need?" Charlotte looked around the busy room. "Aprons first." By 10 o'clock, both brothers had discovered that helping at an art workshop involved far less conversation than they had feared. Ryan spent 20 minutes searching for missing paintbrushes because one little boy insisted every brush needed a proper parking spot. Ethan carefully helped another child rinse watercolor trays without splashing blue paint across the floor. Neither task felt important. Yet somehow, both mattered. During lunch, David Bennett approached them. "You must be Charlotte's brothers?" The two men exchanged an uneasy glance. "We are." David smiled warmly. "I've heard she has brothers." The sentence carried no accusation, only simple fact. He extended his hand. "I'm Lily's dad." Ryan looked toward Lily laughing beside Charlotte. "She looks wonderful." David nodded proudly. "She does?" He paused before adding, "Your sister had a lot to do with that." Both brothers quietly answered, "We know." Later that afternoon, one of the youngest children accidentally knocked over an entire cup of blue paint. The paint spread across the table and dripped toward the floor. The little girl immediately burst into tears. "I'm sorry." "I'm sorry." Ryan knelt beside her. "Hey." She looked up with frightened eyes. "I ruined everything." Ryan smiled gently. "No." He reached for a clean sheet of paper. Then he pressed the edge into the spilled paint, creating soft blue shapes. Charlotte noticed and walked over. "What are we making?" Ryan shrugged. "I honestly don't know." Charlotte smiled. "I do." She handed the little girl a yellow brush. "Let's turn the spill into flowers." Within minutes, several children joined. Blue puddles became a sky. Yellow flowers appeared beneath them. Tiny butterflies filled the empty spaces. The little girl laughed again. Charlotte quietly looked at Ryan. "That's how this place works." He understood. Some mistakes could not be erased, but many could become something unexpectedly beautiful. As families began leaving that afternoon, Ethan remained behind, helping fold chairs. He glanced toward the display case holding the chipped blue mug. "I've been thinking." Charlotte continued stacking chairs beside him. "About what?" "Mom." She looked at him. "I keep wondering what she'd say." Charlotte smiled softly. "I don't." "You don't?" She shook her head. "I think she'd tell us exactly what she always did." He waited. "Take care of each other." Ethan laughed quietly. "That sounds like her." "It does." Across the room, Emily locked the supply cabinet before walking over. "Everyone's gone." Olivia joined them carrying Lily's sunflower painting. "I already framed it." Charlotte admired it once more. "It'll hang beside the original blue mug." Lily smiled proudly. "Can I come see it next week?" Emily laughed. "You don't even have to ask." The afternoon sunlight slowly stretched across the empty studio. No one seemed eager to leave. Finally, Charlotte walked toward the display case. She unlocked it carefully. Everyone watched as she lifted out the old blue mug. Time had faded its color. The chip along the handle remained exactly the same. She turned toward Ethan. "Would you hold this?" He looked surprised. "Me?" She nodded. Carefully, almost reverently, he accepted the mug. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Charlotte looked around the room. "When I first held this mug," she smiled toward Emily, "I thought it represented everything I had lost." Emily nodded quietly. "Now." Charlotte looked at the people surrounding her. Emily, Olivia, Lily, David, Ryan, Ethan, volunteers cleaning tables in the background, children's paintings covering every wall. It reminds me of everything kindness can build. She gently took the mug back and returned it to its place inside the display. No longer simply an object, now a witness to fear overcome, to strangers becoming family, to forgiveness offered without forgetting, to ordinary people choosing extraordinary compassion one quiet day at a time. As the lights were turned off and the front doors locked, snow began falling outside once again. Charlotte paused before leaving. She looked back through the glass one final time. The spotlight above the display case softly illuminated the blue mug. Its tiny crack cast a delicate shadow across the shelf. For years, she had believed the crack represented the hardest chapter of her life. Now she understood something different. Without that crack, she might never have met Emily. Without that season of loneliness, there would have been no foundation, no hospital art rooms, no meal program, no Lily, no thousands of children discovering hope through paint and kindness. Some wounds never completely disappear, but they can become the places where compassion quietly enters. Charlotte slipped her arm through Emily's as they stepped into the falling snow. Behind them walked Ethan and Ryan carrying folded tables to the storage shed without being asked. They weren't trying to rewrite the past. They were simply learning to be present in the future. Charlotte smiled as she watched them. Then together they locked the door and walked home beneath the winter sky. Because broken never meant empty. It simply meant there was still room for love, forgiveness, and hope to fill what once seemed impossible to restore. And sometimes all it takes to begin changing a life is one warm bowl of soup, one chipped blue coffee mug, and one ordinary person willing to stay when everyone else walks away. True kindness is rarely loud. It doesn't always come from the people we expect, and it often arrives in the smallest, most ordinary moments: a warm meal, a patient conversation, a hand that refuses to let go when everyone else walks away. This story reminds us that family is not defined only by blood, but by the people who choose to stand beside us when life becomes unbearable. Pain can leave scars, betrayal can break our hearts, and loneliness can make us feel forgotten. Yet those same wounds can become the very places where compassion grows. Charlotte's journey teaches us that forgiveness is not about pretending the past never happened. It is about refusing to let the past steal the future. Emily's unwavering kindness proves that a single act of generosity can ripple through countless lives, touching people we may never even meet. Every encouraging word, every sacrifice, every moment of empathy has the power to change someone's story forever. So no matter what you're facing today, remember, this being broken does not mean being empty. Sometimes our greatest strength is born from the cracks we thought would destroy us. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever met someone whose kindness changed your life in a way you'll never forget? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story might become the encouragement someone else desperately needs today. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about hope, resilience, forgiveness, and the extraordinary power of ordinary kindness, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next inspiring journey. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.